Fermenting under pressure, is it a pro brewer's secret weapon or just another homebrewer gimmick that's snuck into the big leagues? You've probably seen the hype, the PET fermenters that homebrewers use, the promises of lightning fast lagers and forums full of just crank it up to 2 bar, mate. But here's the thing, in a pro brewery, pressure fermentation isn't a trick, it's a tool. And if you use it like a gimmick, your beer's going to suffer. In this episode of Quality-focused Pro Brewers, I'm breaking down exactly what pressure fermentation really does to your yeast, your flavour profile, and your production timeline. You'll learn why blindly copying homebrew techniques can backfire and what parameters you actually need to control and which beer styles benefit and which ones get completely wrecked under pressure. This isn't about experimentation, it's about mastery. So if you're ready to run a proper pressure trial in your brewery with clarity, control, and confidence, this episode's for you. Now let's get brewing. G'day brewers, welcome to the Quality-focused Pro Brewers Podcast. My name is Hendo and I am a pro brewer coach from the Rockstar Brewer Academy. I help professional brewers all over the world cut through the internet noise and misinformation so that they get the technical information and quality systems they need so they can run an amazing brewery that brews amazing world-class beer. Hey, today I wanted to talk about something that kind of transcends the homebrewer, pro brewer relationship out there, and that is pressure fermentation. So what we're going to talk about today is the pros and cons and real world application in an actual commercial brewery of pressure fermentation, how to implement it in a way that actually benefits your beer. Because are you a pro brewer who's looking to speed up your tank time, control your beer flavor, or experiment without the guesswork, or is it just a gimmick that's just used by homebrewers because they can? We're going to talk about all the different parameters that us professional brewers use in order to control our yeast and our fermentation, and why pressure is just one piece of the puzzle. What pressure fermentation really does to your yeast and your beer and your fermentation kinetics, and what it does not. And we're going to talk all the truth about the flavor impact, tank residence time savings, and how to actually trial pressure fermentation in your brewery. Pressure fermentation has really exploded over the last maybe 5 to 7, maybe 8 years or so. And I think a lot of that has come from the homebrewer scene. We've got the homebrew fermentation vessels out there like the Fermzilla that are actually the PET fermentation vessels that homebrewers use that are actually able to hold pressure. I remember when I first started homebrewing, I had one of those opaque plastic, non-pressurizable plastic fermenters, and now most homebrewers are brewing on PET fermenters that can hold pressure. And so that led a lot of homebrewers to go, well, because I can apply pressure to my fermentation, then I will apply pressure to my fermentation. But ultimately what happens is homebrewers go and try pressure fermentation and they wind up with inconsistent results. Why? It's because pressure isn't just some magic switch that you can just turn up and expect the yeast to behave the same as what you've always used to them behaving. It's just one of the many dials that we have at our disposal when we're adjusting and managing our yeast and fermentation. Quite often as well, a lot of homebrewers in particular and some pro brewers out there, they use the wrong yeast strains under pressure. There are some yeast strains out there that just do not like pressure or do not need to use pressure. So we're going to talk a little bit about what works and how to trial pressure fermentation in a way that fits your quality system in your brewery. So when we are running yeast and fermentation in our brewery, there's a number of different metrics that we have control over. Quite often, if you take the gimmick style approach, just turning the pressure up on a fermentation without adjusting any of the other metrics is only going to lead to off flavors in your beer and inconsistent results in your beer. Sluggish ferments, poor kinetics, poor yeast health, autolysis, acetaldehyde, all these sorts of things that are going to happen if you get it wrong. Yeast performance is not just about the temperature and the pressure. we've got a lot of dials that we can adjust in order to make our yeast change the way that it behaves. Probably the most important mind shift that you need to be mindful of when you are thinking about yeast in your brewery, whether you're pressure fermenting or not, is that you need to treat your yeast like a pet. Because remember, it's a living thing. It's not just a powder. Let's say you're using dry yeast in your brewery. It's not just some powder that you throw on the top of the wort at the end of brew day and expect it to go and do its thing. It's a living and breathing microorganism. And so when you take that into consideration, you need to think about your yeast like a pet and not just an ingredient, so to speak. If you think about your yeast like a pet, and you think about the ways in which you can change the way that the environment that the yeast are living, there's lots of things that you can change. You can change the temperature, you can change the pitch rate, the number of cells that you're pitching at the start of fermentation. You have the ability to change the amount of nutrient that's available to the fermentation. You have the ability to control wort oxygenation levels. In the brew house, using things like mash temperature or grist composition, we can change the wort fermentability, whether there are simple sugars, complex sugars, or unfermentable sugars in our wort. We have control over the yeast and how it's stored and whether you repitch it or not, and the viability and vitality of the yeast. We control the strain that we will pitch into our beer. And then finally, we can get to things like pressure. So imagine if you think about your yeast like a pet for a second. And if I was to go and pitch yeast into a really warm ferment, much higher than what I normally would, what would you expect the outcome of that pet to produce? It's not going to be happy, and therefore it's going to create all these off flavors, right? The same thing goes for pressure. Pressure is just one of the dials that we are in control of, but don't ignore the rest, right? Especially when it comes to things like your pitch rate and your oxygenation and your temperature. So now that we've established all of the different dials that we're in control of, what does pressure fermentation actually do? Okay. Quite often, and I've had this happen within the Rockstar Brewer Academy, where I've had a member post in our private Facebook group about how they trialed pressure fermentation. They read about it online and they just go, yeah, I'm going to give that a shot in my pale ale, and wound up with a stalled fermentation and odd flavors in the beer. What happens is when you increase the pressure, you're actually increasing the stress on the cell wall, and you are going to suppress ester production. You're going to suppress things like fusels, higher alcohols. The yeast will behave differently under pressure. So if we think about the start of fermentation, we have our lag phase, then we lead into our exponential phase, our growth phase, and that sort of thing. Normally what happens is yeast cells will start to divide and multiply. However, under pressure, that doesn't happen. Because the pressure exists, if you think about putting pressure on something, the first thing that living organism is going to do, it's going to try and reinforce the cell walls so that things from outside of the yeast cell don't permeate through into the yeast cell before the yeast cell is ready to metabolize it. And so that increases a lot of stress. Whereas under a no pressure ferment, yeast will be concentrating on yeast cell growth and division. Under a pressure fermentation, it's all about strengthening the cell wall. So all of those lipids and the oxygen that you oxygenate your wort with at the start of fermentation, that's basically going to go to function strengthening the yeast cell walls. Now, because the yeast cells are so busy on strengthening the yeast cell walls and the cell walls are now thicker, a couple of things are going to happen is that a lot of those esters and higher alcohols that a yeast cell will produce are going to get locked inside the yeast cell, and they're not going to leach out into the beer into a part that we can smell and taste. Think esters, isoamyl acetate, for instance, so that banana ester that's pretty synonymous with Hefeweizzen. And you're going to suppress esters and those fruity flavors that are produced by the yeast. The other cool thing that happens is because the yeast are so concentrated on strengthening the cell walls, the cells actually become heavier. So one of the positive benefits you'll get from pressure fermentation is increased yeast flocculation, because the cells, each individual cell is heavier because it's got a thicker cell wall. You can't just think of pressure as just some blunt instrument that you can just go and turn on, expect the yeast to behave in the same way. Pressure works for some styles of beers and some yeast strains, but it's really risky for others. So if you don't have a clear target and a system for measuring the impact of what happens to your beer under pressure fermentation, it's going to work against you. So now that we know the dials that we can change during fermentation and what pressure fermentation essentially does, what's the best way to trial pressure fermentation in your brewery? The best way to do it is to basically log everything before and after you start to use pressure in your fermentations in your brewery. Because you want to be, if you're not, you obviously as a professional brewer, we're doing dailies or grabs or whatever it is you call it, where you do your daily checks on your gravity, your temperature, your pH, and you've got to basically log your control so that when you bring pressure into the mix, that you know what changes have happened with those fermentation kinetics. And if you use a brewery management software like Beer 30 or something like that, you can overlay fermentation charts on top of each other from multiple batches and come up with some cool comparison data. Before you go and implement pressure fermentation in your brewery, you need to have a clearly defined target beer profile, which means you've got to have your quality clearly defined in terms of fit for use and true to brands. Just to recap what that means. Fit for use means anything that you can measure with an instrument that makes a number is called fit for use. And true to brand is a written description of what the beer looks like, smells like, tastes like, and feels like. You have to have that clear definition of quality because you're about to undertake a major change to your beer by implementing pressure. You've got to get your pitch rate right. Because the yeast cells are more focused under pressure of reinforcing the cell walls as opposed to cell division and cell growth, then you need to pitch more yeast. Typically, you need to pitch usually 20 to 40% more yeast cells so that there's less stress on the yeast and there's more cells to be able to do the job of fermentation. You need to make sure that your yeast is nice and healthy and viable. So viability and yeast cell counts pretty easy to do with a microscope and a hemocytometer and maybe some methylene blue indicator or something like that. If your viability isn't above 95%, don't touch that yeast slurry. Go find a healthier colony that you can go and repitch. Make sure that you've got your wort oxygenation done properly because the yeast cells are going to be concentrated on strengthening the cell walls, that takes a lot of lipid synthesis to be able to do that, and that requires oxygen. Make sure you've got sufficient nutrients. So you want your free amino nitrogen levels to be at least 250 parts per million. You can go and brew some wort and you can send it off to a lab pretty easy and go and get some fan numbers. But you want to make sure that there's sufficient nutrient in your wort at the start of fermentation so the yeast have all the vitamins and minerals they need to have a nice healthy pressure fermentation. And then when we start to implement pressure, it's not a question of basically knocking out our wort into the fermenter, pitching yeast, and then applying head pressure. You change the temperature quickly and you shock the yeast. Rapid changes in pressure will also shock the yeast. So basically you want to start low, and then as the fermentation builds and the CO2 is generated by the yeast, then the pressure will naturally build up. Now, one thing I will say here is around the safety side of things, because you are going to be fermenting under pressure, don't be like one of those people out on the internet on the videos that you see where they accidentally take off a carb stone and get blown across the floor of their brewery and that sort of thing. Be mindful of the safety considerations of fermenting under pressure. Please, for the love of God, please do not use your pressure relief valve as the only mechanism to control pressure in your ferment. Your pressure relief valve is like a fuse, right? And so that's the last resort safety mechanism. So make sure you've got a separate adjustable spunding valve on the tank that sets the pressure level. And if that fails, then your pressure relief valve will kick in as your final engineering control to control that hazard. Get good record keeping. So every day you got to be checking gravity, pH, the set temperature of the tank, the actual temperature of the tank, the set pressure, and the actual pressure. And these are things that should be charted and collected every day, twice a day if you're really into it, but at the very least once a day. Choose styles of beer that are going to benefit from pressure fermentation. The styles of beer that are going to benefit from pressure fermentation are things like nice clean lagers. Think your Munich Helles or a Pilsner, maybe a Kolsch, maybe an alt beer, something that's very low ester that you want to be a nice clean beer. Okay. There's yeast strains where you should avoid using pressure. So for example, if you're going to brew a Hefeweizen, right? Hefeweizens are a style of beer, for instance, that relies on fruity esters to be produced. So if you apply pressure, you're going to suppress those esters. Hefeweizen is not the best style of beer to undertake pressure fermentation. The same goes for your Belgian styles, where they rely on esters and phenolics. Any yeast strain that's naturally expressive probably isn't going to be a good fit. I'm not saying that you can't. I'm just saying that it's probably not going to be a good fit for the style of beer that you're trying to produce. Try and avoid pressure fermentation in English styles of beer or yeast strains which have English heritage. For example, Chico. So Chico is already a very clean yeast strain to start with. It's a very neutral yeast strain. So by applying pressure, what are you hoping to achieve? You want to make an already clean yeast strain more clean. And if you think about the heritage of Chico, it's from the Ballantine Brewery and prior to that, the UK, right? So basically, it's got British heritage. And if you think of traditionally how British beers are fermented, they're fermented in open top fermenters or maybe in a Burton Union in a barrel or something like that, but never really with pressure. And the same goes for some of the hazy yeast strains. They also have British heritage. Probably one of the more popular hazy yeast strains, London Ale 3. It's literally telling you that it is of British heritage, and knowing traditionally how British beers are fermented, pressure's probably not the right tool to use for those styles. If you're doing ales, IPAs, or hazy IPAs or something like that, and you're pressure fermenting them, at some point in the future of that batch of beer, you're going to dry hop the beer, and you're going to create safety concerns around dry hopping the beer, because the beer is essentially going to be carbonated, and then you're going to dry hop and you're going to create nucleation points in the beer, and you're going to have the gushers coming out of your tank. Pick your yeast strains, pick your beer styles, log everything, and then do a side-by-side test between a non-pressure fermented version of the beer that you're brewing and a pressure fermented version of the same beer. And make sure that the only variable is the pressure itself. Pressure's not a hack. It's a controlled trial worth doing. And if you get it right, you're going to wind up with some amazing outcomes like reduced tank residence time. You're going to help with the carbonation of the beer, natural carbonation. So you're going to have better head retention. You're going to reduce your CO2 costs because you're not having to force carbonate your beer. There's a lot of good things about pressure fermentation, but it's not for every style of beer or every strain of yeast. Speaking of yeast, one of the things you might want to be doing in your brewery is propagating yeast. And I've got a 3-part video series on YouTube on how to build your own yeast propagator that'll do up to, say, 10 hectoliters or about 7 or 8 barrels of wort. You can propagate that much yeast, and it's going to cost you under $500 to build it. I've got the guide there to basically show you how to build this yeast propagator and the recipe for the right media and all that sort of stuff, so you can go and actually propagate your own yeast. If you head to rockstarbrewer.com/yeast propagator, you can go download the plans to that. I've got a QR code on the screen if you're watching this on YouTube. Go and check it out. It's a really good way to go down the path of yeast husbandry in your brewery. That's my gift to you, and I hope you enjoy it. We actually have a whole level in the Rockstar Brewer Academy dedicated to yeast husbandry. The level is called Practical Craft Brewer Yeast Husbandry, where we dive into details around yeast repitching, yeast propagation, and how to manage yeast in your brewery so that you can save costs. And people often say that this is too good to be true, but you can save more than 90% off your yeast costs if you're currently brewing with single-use dry yeast and you're moving to repitching yeast, and you can do that with confidence. And it's one of my favorite parts of the Rockstar Brewer Academy, and it's really cool. Running pressure fermentation without adjusting the rest of your yeast plan, it's like tossing a load of bricks in your fermentation vessel and hoping for the best. The real power comes out when you lay the right foundations. Pressure helps to build the house faster, not collapse it. But if you just go randomly and introduce pressure, you're going to wind up with some not so favorable outcomes in your beer. But if you get it right, you're going to be making some amazing beers really fast, particularly your lagers. They're really cool. Make sure that you run a proper trial. So keep a control batch for your side-by-side testing. Don't forget to adjust your pitch rate and increase your fermentation temperature slightly. Do your daily logs, gravity, pH, pressure, set, and actual numbers. Monitor. Do a true to brand test to monitor for things like acetaldehyde or autolysis, any signs of yeast stress or incomplete fermentation, and do that blind with your team. And then you can decide if pressure fermentation is right for you. If you want to check out something cool, go check out this episode next. I'm pretty sure it's got something you'd be interested in there. Thanks heaps for watching. Catch you in the next episode. Cheers.